try to explain why we are hearing actually conflicting reports. My Lord indicated that Afghan Taliban are meeting with the Afghan government, Afghan Taliban are meeting with the Americans in Qatar, Afghan Taliban are divided Moscow, Moscow says no they're not, Afghan government says we will meet with them, Taliban says we meet with everyone but Afghan government. What is this confusion about? Is it something unusual? And so that's why I will discuss in a more frank, in a more analytical way, what does it take to, this is part of the game. That's how it's done. That's how it works. So, and again, just recently you heard about meetings being postponed in Moscow, meetings possibly taking place in Qatar or other places. So, I emphasize that what I'm talking about is based on my involvement in this process since probably 2004 when the initial contacts started with certain elements of the Taliban. And also, I served in Colombia and I worked with President Uribe and I had an opportunity to travel there and to see and observe how this was done and how difficult it was. So, consider actually my discussion, my personal opinion more or less, than the position of the Afghan government in each subject matter. A question that we've been asked always is, do you have a peace plan? Yes, we do. Every successful peace plan is a classified peace plan, and we do have it, with scenarios, with detailed discussion in the highest level of the government. And we also have a peace plan put forward by the Peace Council. But keep in mind, any public peace plan is a PR document. It's not a roadmap to the peace. You do need to have a PR document for peace process to strengthen national consensus, to give assurance. Because as soon as you talk about peace, there will be people that will not like it. In Afghanistan specifically, women will be concerned. There will be minorities that will be concerned. So you have to have two approaches. A real peace plan is a covered peace plan, is a classified peace plan. And now the second question is, do you really need a peace plan? Of course, when we listen to our international partners, they will say, yes, you have to have a peace plan. And that's why occasionally Afghanistan put forward a different peace plan. But again, my personal opinion, seeing this in different parts of the world, no, you don't need a peace plan. You need a peace concept. You should know what you are trying to achieve through the peace process. It doesn't make sense if you come up with a comprehensive peace plan while the other party is not interested to talk to you. It's like, I joke about always planning a wedding when you have not proposed to the girl yet. You don't know if she can accept it or not. So this is, you start like contracts, you sit down with the other side and then develop a comprehensive peace plan. You have to have a because if you put forward a peace plan with all the details without the other party showing serious interest, you undermine consensus among your own people. People that say, wait a minute, what are you doing? They just killed 70 people on the street in Kabul, and then you're talking about peace with them? And if you want to give them jobs or ministries or whatever. So it's too early. You don't want to undermine actually the consensus among your own people by putting forward a peace plan that the other party may or may not accept. But again, it does not mean that privately you should have a peace plan. You should prepare for scenarios. What if I propose this and they come up with that? This is something that's being done in Afghanistan by the government. Another thing that you hear actually a lot is that there's no military solution to a conflict. There is. There's always a military solution to a conflict if you can afford it. The best solution to any conflict is military. It's over by World War I, World War II. Over. But if you can afford it. If you can afford it or your enemy can afford it, there is a military solution. They will take you out or you take him out. It's simple as that. Of course, now it gets to the second point that you also hear about saying that you have to negotiate from a position of strength. Well, if I'm in a position of strength, I'll take out the Taliban. The Taliban are the position of strength, they will take us out all. No, you enter into peace process because both sides are mutually weak. So this is a slogan. You have to negotiate from a position of strength. If we are in a position of strength, we will just take out If they are the forces, they will take us all out. So you enter into a peaceful process because of the position of the weakness on both sides, or frustration. And the aim of this process is also to further weaken the other side. You're not entering into the process to empower the other side. You're entering into the peace process to weaken the other side, and they have also the same objective, to weaken you as part of the process. So, of course, this is harder for the government. Keep in mind that a government will lose by not winning. Insurgency will win by not losing. So the position of the government is harder on that. And because, as I mentioned, if the government does not win, it's losing. If the insurgency is not losing, it wins because they are there. That's all it takes. Their job is to destroy and distract. The government's job is to build and provide services. So that you are not on equal footing when it comes to this issue. And that's why when you enter into negotiation, you should recognize realistically that both sides are mutually weak. And also when you enter into the peace talk, you put serious question on the other side too. Since 2002, probably, there has been no meaningful discussions on that with the Taliban about how the peace would look like for them. What is the income that they want to have actually out of that? And by putting this question forward, you are making them think about this position, but also weakening them. Because different elements in that the group that's called Taliban may have different objectives, different deliverables out of this war process in Afghanistan. So you would like them to start thinking about it. What do you want out of it? And where do you see yourself? And there's another question that is also interesting, and I can compare my experience on that with Colombia. How long the peace process will take? It takes longer, usually, traditional wisdom, Colombia and others, it takes longer than war. But I think through my discussions and contacts, that the peace process in Afghanistan, if it starts, honestly, it's going to be a fast process. And why is this so? The reason is that if you compare IRA or FARC or many other actually similar peace process in other places, these were ideological groups. They were fighting for an ideology, for a system, for a governance system. And that's why it took longer than peace process. But what keeps Taliban united is war. That's it. And as I mentioned, like since 2002, we didn't see any new plan we put forward as far as governance, or except for very general things, you want implementation of Sharia or the foreign troops should go out. Outside this, we didn't see anything more specific. So what keeps Taliban united is war. And as soon as you start doubting actually the future of the war, Taliban will recognize that they lose ground quickly. And therefore, they will be actually interested, and I think for that reason, because there's no ideological basis for their struggle. The peace process in Afghanistan will be fast, and this is also based on my contact with some of those elements, that they think, well, if peace process starts rapidly, what's going to happen to us? They start thinking about their future. And this is good, and again, and the other thing is that if the only thing that keeps you united is war, or jihad, the way the Taliban call it, or whatever you call it, when you start questioning that, when you start hearing about contacts between them and Americans and Afghans in different capitals, it's harder to mobilize the foot soldier. So you got to go out and fight and get yourself killed and wear the suicide bomb while I'm going to Qatar and having actually an afternoon tea with my American colleagues. So it makes it difficult to mobilize actually the foot soldier. That's why I think the process will be faster than comparing to other countries. And we also saw that in the last ceasefire during the Eid holidays that took place. And again, Taliban allowed their soldiers to come to the cities, they probably wanted to show a kind of a unity of command, but the fact that their soldiers look like they're missing actually their normal life like any other Afghan. They are more interested actually into peace than that made actually some of the Taliban leadership worried that if this thing gets momentum, it will be harder actually to keep people mobilized for the war. And another question that I've been asked sometimes, and I will be discussing it, is we have not seen results. No, we will not be seeing results in a few months or few years to come, because the real objective of a peace process should be strategic. Cannot be tactical. We cannot have a peace agreement or a peace accord because there's an election coming up or the president of this or that country they like or dislike it. You have to have a strategic approach to that. If you want to do it for tactical reason, most probably it's not going to fail. Or most probably it's going to fail and it's not going to deliver the objective. Another issue that is being discussed usually is where is a good venue? Kabul, Islamabad, a neutral country, and where the discussion is. Of course, we prefer Kabul, Afghanistan, of course, that's it. And that relates also to who are the real stakeholders. But generally, we should understand that kind of venue shopping is part of the positioning for peace process. So they will be doing it. They will propose different venues, we will propose different venues, and our friends will propose venues because of the regional interests. So that's part of the positioning, part of this process is to gain actually advantages by choosing a venue that is most advanced. It doesn't happen in many these processes that venue shopping is part of the positioning. But it will settle into one or more venues. And the role of other countries, especially now that we see that countries in our neighborhood are getting more involved. First and foremost, this is the real stakeholder for this war is Afghan government elected by the Afghan people in the parliament. Secondary stakeholders are Americans and Pakistan. But then there's no substitute for the Afghan people and the Afghan government in this process. Of course, it's part of, as I mentioned, part of the positioning. Taliban says, no, we just want to talk with America. And we, in the past, said, no, we just want to talk with Pakistan. Because that's, your president doesn't, these are positioning issues. It's gonna resolve. It's gonna resolve because but as far as other countries playing a role as facilitator, as guarantor, as mediator, that's welcome. And we've made it clear in the past. If they want to act as such, as a mediator, as a facilitator, even as a guarantor, we will consider that. And the question of how to talk. Again, I formulate some of the discussion in the form of a question, knowing that I'll be speaking with a student audience and people who really would like to debate issues. How to talk. The best way to talk is to talk direct and correct. That's how a real peace process will achieve the result that's needed. As I mentioned, there are primary stakeholders, Afghans and Taliban, and others will help and assist, but the real owner of this process should be these two players. And it's premature, people ask, will Taliban have a role in the government and all that? Again, hard to decide. If they're interested, yes. If they want to be the full government, I think, again, based on my contact with them, they know that they cannot govern Afghanistan just by themselves. Even if they want to govern Afghanistan by themselves, they cannot fund it. They can fund it probably through narcotics or some other dangerous means, but they learn the lessons when they're funding the government through means that led to their complete fall in 9/11 and others. So that's an understanding that to my contacts, that's obvious that more and more, at least the guys that they talk to me even if they desire to govern for themselves, they know that they cannot fund this in a way that's sustainable. And I've been asked also in the past, and says, well, but the Taliban says they're not talking, they're not coming. The U.S. says, yes, we're talking, but they're not really talking, and all of that. Look, denial is part of this process, part of this game. Contacts are taking place at different levels. As I mentioned, talks are taking place at different levels. Some effective, some not, since 2004. So don't be surprised if you hear officially, especially publicly, that this is, they said we do it, we don't do it. This country said we are not part of it, or we are part of it partially because somebody else asked us. You should make this process deniable, because when you enter into this process, the concern of the Taliban is that they lose actually the support of the foot soldier if everybody sees that they are talking about peace. And the concern of the Afghan government is that to lose the national consensus, especially when Taliban are continue to carry out really brutal attacks in Kabul. You say, well, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Just today, 80 people were killed. So you should understand the concern of both sides if you wanna work for the success of the process. And it's normal for both parties in any peace process to use proxies, to use real representatives, to use decoys. That's how it's done. Again, a question that's been usually asked is, who are you going to be talking to? Are the Taliban one unified movement, or there are different groups? Doesn't matter. If you want to talk to whoever's on the other side. Again, if your objective of the peace process is to weaken the other side. Even sometimes people ask, should we talk to some extreme elements, say Afghani or even ISIS? If it helps weakening the other side, yes, I do. That's the objective. When you enter into peace process, their objective is not to keep us united. Our objective is not to keep us united. It's a practical approach. So that's why, and again, this issue of, I totally understand the concern. Well, some of the groups are terrorists. They're religious extremists. And yes, the reality of the war is that we need to deal with people. And keep in mind that when you start talking, every group was a terrorist to somebody at some time. Look at PLO, look at IRA, many others. Hard to compare them actually to some really religiously driven terrorists right now. Every group was a terrorist to somebody at some point. And so I had only 10 minutes, 15 minutes, I think I am over the time. So I'll wrap up actually my discussion. I will really look forward, myself and my colleagues here, to some recommendations, some more discussions about the challenges ahead. But I just wanted to provide a platform about one of the most important issues for Afghanistan and our close ally UK, reconciliation and the challenges ahead, and also give an understanding that it is going to be a long process. It's going to process by ups and downs. And it's going to be conflicting news, conflicting reports, as I mentioned, denials, acceptance, venues, change of venues, and others. That's part of the game. I think overall there is a good, strong understanding and a commitment by the Afghan government and an understanding by the Taliban that peace and peace process is the only way to, right now in this condition, is the only way, probably not the best way. It's the only way to end actually that conflict. And we will continue to work on it. I just wanted to give you a bedrock of how this peace and reconciliation generally flow, and why you are hearing actually sometimes conflicting reports or different reports about different issues. I really appreciate the interest. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellency, Lord Bruce, a very big thanks to Ajit Bambula and the Democracy Forum for hosting us here today on what is a truly difficult and complex topic. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Dr. John Hemmings, the Director of the Asia Studies Center at the Henry Jackson Society. It's funny, but I've just come from a dinner last night on discussing a different peace process, and that's to do with North Korea, in which we also have a large number of states, not as many non-state actors, but also a similarly technical issue, an issue about sovereignty, an issue about security, and of course an issue about economic prosperity. And if we look across the international relations spectrum, we can see, if you're in negotiation, you're doing really well right now. If you're dealing with US-China trade issues, if you're dealing with the Taliban peace process with the US, so, reconciliation, negotiation, diplomacy, the art of diplomacy, all of these issues are more important now than ever. So whether you're a practitioner or a student of the region or a student of diplomacy, we hope that this will be a useful and interesting panel for you. I'm humbled by my company here. I'm amongst four of some of the most impressive authorities on either the regional context or internal domestic context to Afghanistan's security situation. We're going to do it in two chunks for you. We're going to have a kind of approach. The first session, which, if you want to break it down, is really like a kind of external environment in which this peace process must occur, in which the various actors must all be consulted. And then an internal one, although I'm sure there will be a huge amount of overlap nonetheless. I remember last night someone mentioned a quote that the North Korean issue is similar to a multi-tiered chessboard with overlapping boards with more than 7 players. I think we can agree that this issue, has 7 major powers and 3 international government organizations. Far trumps, if I may use that term, trumps the North Korean issue in some ways. Sitting on my immediate right, Dr. Barnett Rubin, the Associate Director of the Center on International Cooperation at NYU, is someone who has had an incredibly useful, for the purpose of this panel, career. He's, from the very beginning of the Bonn process, he was the special advisor to the Secretary General for Afghanistan during the negotiations. He has advised UNAMA. He has been involved in the drafting of the Constitution of Afghanistan, the Afghanistan Compact, and the Afghanistan National Development Strategy. So he will be first speaking on the international context. And then following shortly after, someone with no less a prestigious background and career, Emily Winter-Botham, Senior Research Fellow on my left side, I should say, Royal United Services Institute, my old alma mater, if I might say. So she has had a long career looking at extremism, radicalization in the region, but she's also had a long career of reconciliation in the region. Between 2009 and 2015, she was in Afghanistan and Pakistan as political advisor for the European Union Special Representative. She's also a friend of a mutual friend of ours who works specifically on, his research was on negotiating with the Taliban and different strategies. And so she will then follow Dr. Rubin. So Dr. Rubin, if I may first turn to you, sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, but I think you didn't read the introduction handbook very well. You're supposed to lower expectations. But in any case, I want to thank Lord Bruce and Ambassador Jawad for their introductory remarks. And you feel perhaps my crossing the ocean is superfluous, but I shall have occasion to refer to them. Actually, I wanted to ask you a question last time. Should I speak for 15 minutes or should I end at 2:45?
gently
Okay.
curve up a little bit at the book.
That's fine. Okay. So first, if I just may comment on a few of the points that Sayed Jawad made, who, by the way, we worked together quite a bit because at the time that I was advising the UN on Afghan constitution and Afghan national development strategy, much of that time he was chief of staff to President Karzai. So we were in constant contact in Kabul in those days. First, a point about plans. Remember, there's a military saying that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And that is true in peace as well as in war. However, President Eisenhower said, plans are useless, but planning is essential. And that is what Ambassador Jawad was referring to when he talked about scenarios. Because by planning, you acquaint yourself with different alternatives. Of course, in negotiation, just to elaborate on what he said, if one side proposes something too early, then the other side is obligated to reject it, even if it's something that they might actually agree to if they came to it through the course of negotiation. So you must remember that negotiation is above all a process, and it's a process of changing the relationships among the actors there. And it's not only, of course, everyone goes into it wanting to weaken the other side, but there's also a quest for mutual gain because, after all, everyone can win in some way from peace. Of course, you can win more than others, and so it's a combination. It's not a zero-sum game, but it's not entirely positive either. It's complex, and that is why these games of secrecy, venue shopping, and so on take place. As far as success is concerned, there's a vast double standard. So my experience in Washington is that if you have one meeting to negotiate and the peace does not result, then the summary of it is peace talks fail. Which actually, you could use that as a headline for all negotiations until the very last meeting, because that is the way the negotiations work. And if the military strategy is failing, then the headline is, we need more troops. So I'm not sure of the logic of that, but that's the political logic. I hope we can reverse that. I think we are perhaps seeing it being reversed now. Now, let me say a few things about. I'm going to look at the international aspects of the conflict and go back historically a little bit. Unfortunately, that means I'm going to pass over some of the humanitarian issues like the terrible massacres that have taken place in recent days, the repeated massacres of Hazaras in particular in both Afghanistan and in Pakistan, the increase in the number of casualties, and some of the positive elements such as the growth of the People's Peace Movement, which I had the opportunity to speak when I was in Kabul in late June, but we can discuss all of that during the questions. I would like to focus on a question that we haven't really raised so far, and which often gets neglected in these discussions. And that is, what will be the strategic position of Afghanistan after a peace agreement? And specifically, what will be the role of the United States and U.S. military forces and U.S. financial assistance to Afghanistan after such an agreement? Because the war in Afghanistan did not start because of political differences between the Afghan government and the Taliban. There was no such Afghan government at the time, and the Taliban were not overthrown for that reason. It was an international action. So let me just, at the main demand of the Taliban, people have been constantly been asking, what do the Taliban want? The Taliban are pretty clear about what they want. They want the complete withdrawal of all foreign troops from Afghanistan. Of course, if you talk to them privately, they will give you nuances of what that means and under what conditions, but that is their fundamental, publicly enunciated condition. That is also a position which, to one extent or another, has been adopted by many or most of the neighboring countries of Afghanistan. And that is one of the reasons that there is some convergence of interests among those neighboring countries, not just Pakistan and the Taliban, on the question of opposing a long-term U.S. presence in Afghanistan and also in opposing, at least they claim to, Daesh and the Islamic State. Now, let me just make a few historical remarks. there's a basic reality which is usually left to World Bank or IMF to kind of deal with, which really is of fundamental political importance and does not get enough attention, which is Afghanistan defined as the current territory within the internationally recognized borders of Afghanistan has never been able to produce enough resources to fund its own state. Never. It has always relied on some kind of foreign assistance, especially in the military realm. And that is not, as the Marxists used to say, it is no accident. Because Afghanistan was delimited by the British and the Russians in the late 19th, early 20th century to be a buffer state between their empires. And part of the fact of being a buffer state is that it should be dependent on the British so that it was controllable. So it was set up, that's the reason for the point that Lord Bruce was talking about, the Durand Line and the changes in the territory of Afghanistan, and I'm not here to say that changing that line or changing the territory will improve the situation. But that deprived Afghanistan of some of its most productive territories. And another part, so part of the agreement was losing those territories, another part was subsidies, especially military subsidies to a highly centralized government to subdue all of the various people in the region, and an agreement between the British and the Russians that neither of them would have forces in Afghanistan or even originally diplomats. So that, because of course the first and second Anglo-Afghan wars were partly set off by mutual suspicions and fears between the British and the Russians, which, and then Afghan actors of course actively participated in that and tried to benefit from it, something which would never happen today, of course. So the state is, and now the state is even more dependent on foreign assistance, largely because two things. One is it is facing a much higher degree of threat from its environment than it has in the past. And second, it is facing a much higher level of demand for social services from its population than it ever did in the past. And both of these, and these things are connected, they're both related to the social processes unleashed by this war, which has gone on not for 17 years, but for 40 years, and has resulted in many revolutionary changes whose consequences we are only starting to see. Now, that consensus about, keeping Afghanistan isolated broke down gradually over the years. It broke down finally in the mid-1970s. For reasons I'm sure you're all familiar with. And then since then, we've had, roughly speaking, 3 periods. We had a period of Soviet hegemony in Afghanistan. We had a period of no hegemony in Afghanistan. And followed by a brief period of attempted Pakistani hegemony in Afghanistan. And then we had a period of U.S. hegemony in Afghanistan. Now, the first, the two obviously did not create stability because while the Soviets may have felt that they were trying to bring stability to Afghanistan, that created a security dilemma because others felt threatened by the way they were trying to bring stability to Afghanistan. And there was a huge global reaction as well as an Afghan reaction to it. During the period when there was no superpower involvement in Afghanistan, of course, basically the state collapsed. There was no army administration, and it was unable to fund any of those things, and the neighboring states engaged in various kinds of proxy wars. Pakistan, through the Taliban, tried to re-establish its own hegemony over Afghanistan, and then for the reasons that you know, we just commemorated the anniversary, the United States invaded. And now, when the United States first intervened, I should say, in 2001, it was backed by a very large international consensus in the belief that the United States was fighting against a common enemy. President Putin personally intervened with the leaders of Central Asia to help the U.S. get access to those territories. The United States cooperated on the ground, this is, not only diplomatically with Iran, which I experienced myself working in the UN at that time, but also cooperated on the ground with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, with Pasdaran, in making contact with the Afghan resistance, and setting up, the first CIA bases were set up with the help of the Iranian intelligence in Panjshir and Bagram and so on. So it was an unusual degree of international cooperation, and that really, Pakistan was a bit of a dissenter, but but was quite isolated and was hoping that things would change in its direction. Now, that kind of consensus is what underlay the first few years of peace, which we all remember so well, and which laid the basis for the system that exists now. Now, how did it break down? I won't talk about the internal developments, which are important, such as the exclusion of Taliban from the Bonn process, the ethnic issues of the composition and political issues of the composition of the government, and so on. But the first sign of the breakdown of the international consensus came in 2005, when the heads of state of what was then a new organization, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, issued a statement in Almaty saying that it was time for the international coalition to close its bases on the territory of Central Asia because the war against terrorism had been concluded. Now, what was behind that? What was behind that was that the U.S. and Afghanistan had issued a declaration of strategic partnership. And that declaration of strategic partnership was the first public sign that Afghan was moving toward a long-term strategic orientation with the United States, not just accepting help from the U.S. and the coalition to fight against terrorism. And the countries of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, though not all to the same degree, if I have time I'll mention that, did not want Afghanistan to have that orientation. Then in 2007, of course, war in Iraq, etc. Dick Cheney stood on Vice President Dick Cheney stood on an aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf and threatened Iran. And the Iranians changed their policy, which was, their policy had been to support, they didn't change it visibly, but they decided that if the United States attacked Iran, they would respond against the United States anywhere that they could reach U.S. forces, including in Afghanistan. Even though that was against their bilateral interest in Afghanistan, but because of the overriding importance of their being attacked by the United States. That was reversed to some extent by the Obama years when the relations with Iran improved. However, I think what's behind the recent changes is the signing of the strategic partnership agreement, which was much more broad than the declaration, right after the 2014 elections. President Karzai, as you know, had refused to sign that. And I should just say, from my experience in the government at the time, I know that within the government, the feeling was that if we pressed President Karzai on a political settlement, we wouldn't get the strategic partnership agreement. And therefore, the priority was the strategic partnership agreement, for whatever reasons. Now, many people in the region and in Afghanistan believe that the U.S. wants to have, that the Strategic Partnership Agreement provides a political and legal framework for the United States to have military bases in Afghanistan indefinitely for reasons that do not have nothing to do with terrorism or Afghanistan, for reasons that have to do with the relationship of the United States to surrounding countries, which, remember, weak and poor as Afghanistan is, its neighbors are quite a contrast to that. China, Russia, and Russia in particular, but also Iran, Pakistan, and India, some of the fastest growing economies in the world today. Therefore, that I think is the underlying reason that since that time we've heard about Russia and Iran reaching out to the Taliban. And we've heard about a convergence of interest among China, Pakistan, Russia, and Iran, which is behind the recent attempt to start the Moscow process. Now, the point is, my title, I gave it this title, what did I give it? Is it, yes, can Afghanistan be secure in the current international context? The role of China is very important. We can talk about that later, because China has a broader economic interest because of the interest in security, and doesn't want the U.S. to leave immediately. Well, no one wants the U.S. to leave immediately. No one has a coherent position. It's sort of like St. Augustine saying, God, Lord, make me chaste, but not yet. So they would like the troops to leave, but not yet. But if we're going to have a political settlement, there has to be an international agreement about what happens to those troops, who's going to continue to fund the Afghan government, and what will be done to counter, even if the Taliban are no longer a threat, what will be done to counter the growth of the Islamic State or the various nebulous groups that are acting in the name of the Islamic State? What will be the counterterrorism platform for the future? At the moment, so even though I'm pleased that my former classmate Zalmay Khalilzad has been given this position and a mandate, and I think that's very important, shows commitment on the part of the United States. As long as our foreign policy consists of picking fights with all of the countries with which we would have to cooperate in order to make peace in Afghanistan, namely Pakistan, Iran, Russia, and China, I don't think we'll be able to get to the final objective. But that is why we do need a global perspective on this conflict as well as local and regional.
Thank you. I'm really conscious of time now, so I'll try and keep this to 10 minutes. But I was thinking yesterday, chatting with a colleague about what I was actually going to talk about, and for the first time, I found myself quite speechless. And you know, I've been following Afghanistan for over a decade, nowhere near as much as everyone else on this panel. But it seems, you know, 1 minute we have this unprecedented ceasefire, then we have a meeting between the US and the Taliban. The Afghan government said it would never accept, and the US said it would never happen. Then we have the near takeover of Ghazni city, whatever some sources may have reported, and intensified attacks across the country. So it leads us to think what really is going on, and I think Ambassador Jawad put that really well in his opening address in terms of a lot of confusion around what is actually happening in Afghanistan. You know, peace talks in Afghanistan tend to be an annual thing. Every year someone goes, oh, we're going to have a peace process, and then gradually talks die off. But perhaps for the first time, things do seem to be aligning. We do seem to have some momentum, and there does seem to be an indication that all major parties to the conflict are actually saying that they want a negotiated settlement. So whilst there are opportunities, there are also spoilers. And that was really what I wanted to talk about in the next 10 minutes. You know, clearly peace is needed. We've touched on some of the ongoing issues in Afghanistan in relation to civilian casualties. I mean, stark numbers. First 6 months of 2013, the number of civilian casualties was nearly 4,000, and in 2018, we're over 5,000. We've had numerous efforts towards peace over the years, some that are well known, some that aren't. You know, the launch of the Afghan Peace and Reintegration Program in 2010, the 2015 meeting between the Afghan government and the Taliban in Pakistan, which of course led or collapsed in the immediate aftermath once the announcement of Mullah Omar's death was made public. Towards the end of last year then, we did think, or things did seem to start to be shifting. So the High Peace Council came forwards and said the Taliban should open a political office in Kabul, start peace negotiations, and importantly, place the onus on them to come up with their own mechanism for how to conduct talks. And significantly, they didn't ask for any preconditions. This had actually followed a number of failed initiatives that I'm not going to go into. And although, I mean, I think it's important to say the Taliban at the time ignored this call from the High Peace Council, we fast forward to May 2018, and at the Kabul process, we see an unprecedented call from President Ghani for unconditional peace talks. The Taliban again appeared to reject this. You know, they came forward with a statement saying that they would only talk to the US, which has been their position they maintained for a number of years. And yet, we then have the unprecedented historic ceasefire. And, you know, we talk about algorithms in relation to Facebook, Twitter, etc. So maybe my feeds are a bit biased, but I had masses of tweets and Facebook messages from Afghans rejoicing in the fact that they were finally able to travel to various parts of the country that they hadn't been able to for a number of years. You know, the pictures of Taliban fighters embracing Afghan national security forces. And that did inject some much needed optimism into the situation. And then we have this meeting, reported, confirmed, whatever, between the US and the Taliban in Doha. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. I do think we need to be cautious about it, but it was an icebreaker. So So before I get on to the positives, the obstacles to peace. Is the Taliban movement actually ready to talk? So we've seen an escalation of attacks since the historic ceasefire. Clearly the Taliban still maintain significant control over the country. Obviously figures change, fluctuate, they're challenged, but it looks like at the moment the Taliban's in control of about 14 to 15% of the country, with the government at about 56%. So there doesn't seem to be any indication that the Taliban at the moment is going to stop its military campaign, and instead they seem to be committed to that cause. On a positive note, it's tempting, I guess, to see this as an attempt by the movement to strengthen their position against, ahead of any potential negotiations. But on the other hand, there is a concern, or I do have a concern, that given that the group is not homogenous, that it could be that some of the military faction of the Taliban in particular, if they do feel that they are still winning, that they still might be spoilers of the process, and they wouldn't actually be willing to enter into talks unless we could see very, very significant conditions. At the same time, there is also the risk that the violence becomes so high that it discourages the Afghan government and the Afghan people from peace. I should say that, I did research in 2009 to 2012 looking at Afghan perceptions of justice, peace and reconciliation, and the consistent finding was that Afghans were willing to compromise in the interest of peace. That doesn't necessarily mean we should forget justice and human rights, but clearly there is a big appetite for some level of stability within the country. There are other issues, I think, still with things like the Qatar office. Reports that the Afghan government, and Ambassador Jai can challenge me later, along with the US, haven't actually been in favour of the Qatar office. The Saudis, not a big fan of it either. Any efforts, I think, to close that office would not be seen as a confidence-building measure by the Taliban. I think one of the things that this meeting in Doha has shown, and some of the statements that have come out of the Taliban, is that they are very consistent that their political representation in Doha are the people we need to be talking to. And that is the channel that needs to stay open. Opening an office in Kabul is one thing, but the Taliban do need a fallback position. The other stumbling block, I think, is the US approach to Afghanistan and the renewed counter-terrorism operations that we've seen. There's a quote, and I always forget who actually said it, but it's, the US has not been in Afghanistan for 17 years. It's been in Afghanistan 17 times for 1 year. And that kind of feels where we're at the moment. We're back with a sort of good, bad, government, Taliban, black, white, which is failing to acknowledge the very complex civil nature of the war and identify the Taliban not only as a military actor, but also as a political one. So I do think we need to be cautious that increased counter-terrorism focuses risk ignoring many of the local dynamics and grievances that are actually part of the Afghan conflict. Airstrikes, another kind of cause for concern, civilian casualties being an obvious recruitment tool. And I think it's something that actually Ambassador Jawad said as well, the Taliban's success doesn't actually rely on their own popularity, but on the unpopularity of others. So there is a real demand at present for the creation of a legitimate Afghan state. So what about that? Big issues facing the government. I am concerned about the government itself, or various members of the government, being a spoiler in any potential process. We have increasing fragmentation among the National Unity Government for a variety of different reasons. Issues such as bringing back Gulbuddin Hekmatyar with Hezb Islami, though historic and potentially a template for peace negotiations with the Taliban, has been disabling, leading to accusations that President Ghani has been trying to kind of increase the Pashtun element of the government in the run-up to the elections. Various issues between Ghani and Dostum. I think he's back now. Will he stay? Will he go? What's going to happen? Internal divisions within Jamiat Islami, and a variety of different coalitions. I cannot keep up with the number of different coalitions that are currently existing, and many of them seem to feature former President Karzai. So there are power brokers who benefit from the current system, and they stand to lose if the Taliban are brought into government. and they could be potential spoilers. I think one of the things when we talk about Afghanistan, we talk about the current nature of the conflict, is to see how far removed some of those in government actually are. If you can drive around in an armoured convoy, if you've got protection at home, if you're benefiting from the current status quo, what is your actual incentive for the conflict to end? And that is one of my concerns. Another obstacle, which actually I think I might leave and just kind of throw it out there, is Pakistan's role in this. What's Pakistan going to do next? Imran Khan, don't know, a lot of rhetoric, not quite sure what his actual approach will be. But I'm not really sure still, Pakistan can actually deliver the Taliban in any case. In terms of opportunities, the positive, the consensus does seem to be shifting towards the need to talk. I think the fact that the conversation in Doha between the US and the Taliban happened in full coordination with the Afghan government is a marked change. If we look back to issues in 2011, Karzai had kind of scuppered these attempts because he felt that they undermined his authority. The Taliban themselves have said that these talks are very helpful, and so we're going to have to see what happens next. We've got a second round scheduled, reportedly, but they do need to go further. And there does need to be some understanding that after these preliminary talks between the US and the Taliban will next speak to the Afghan government. There is the long-standing issue, which Barney touched on, which is, what happens in terms of US troop foreign, presence, given that even though there looks to be some more compromise on the Afghan Taliban side, the key thing is the Taliban want to end the occupation, and they call it an occupation. And I think, again, we need to understand very much that the Taliban do have to justify themselves to their followers. They really can't suddenly shift positions overnight and expect people who've been dying on the battlefield for them to still follow. In terms of policy, actually, I don't really think that is going to be an issue. I think, as Ambassador Jared said, if something happens, it could happen relatively quickly. There are some unpalatable views in both the Afghan government and the Taliban, and that will be something the international community might have to look at how it confronts it moving forwards. Previous concerns about lack of unity, the Taliban wouldn't be able to actually enter into a peace process because they're not unified enough. Hopefully, I think maybe the ceasefire and the fact that it was held demonstrated more unity and homogeneity that would perhaps, people who've been following Afghanistan had actually felt. ISKP, an obstacle and an opportunity. So on the one hand, the Taliban is obviously aware that if they enter into any peace process, there's potentially another group out there to whom their followers can go to. But it's also a convenient enemy. I'm still very cynical about ISKP presence or ISIS or whatever it is, but at the end of the day, it's proving a nice convenient enemy that everyone agrees on that we don't like, and that the Taliban can present itself against. At the same time, it's allowed kind of Russia and Iran to identify that the Taliban is the least worst option, and so some of the regional pieces seem to be aligning too. I'm just going to conclude with a cautionary note. The elections are coming up. Everyone is aligning. We're not sure what's happening. We're not actually even sure, I think, 100% that they're going to go ahead. But it's very difficult to consider peace at that stage at the moment. The Taliban knows it cannot win an election, so it does not want to participate in the electoral process, but it also knows that this time next year we might end up with a different Afghan president. So does it have any real incentive to speak to the Afghan government right now? Elections themselves could also prove deeply divisive. I monitored both rounds of the 2014 elections. I also sat day in, day out counting the unprecedented 100% audit, which I can say was actually kind of the EU's, fault or benefit, whatever it was. But that process itself really undermined the credibility of the elections and the electoral process, and in the process delegitimised the Afghan government. Why turn up to vote for an election in which you could get killed by the Taliban or a suicide bomb going off if actually the final result was something that could have been negotiated without an electoral process. So I'm concerned that this could further delegitimize the Afghan government. Sources from inside Kabul say that these elections look like being the worst ever, which is a terrifying idea. And so one idea, which is not necessarily one I'm going to say which side of the fence I sit on, but might be one for the discussion later, is would it be bad, so bad, not to have elections, and instead to have some form of Bond 2 process, learning from the failures of Bond 1, including the Taliban, and considering issues of justice and human rights, moving beyond the kind of narrow power-sharing models that we've seen, and having an actual broader attempt to reset Afghanistan.
Thank you very much. I think that was quite an interesting end. It's always useful when someone ends with a proposal which gets us thinking. I'll just use my chairman's prerogative to throw a couple of questions at our speakers before opening up, and we'll try to keep them quick so that we can get to you guys very quickly. Dr. Rubin, I wondered to what extent some of your, well, all of your remarks, in fact, seem to indicate that geopolitics and geopolitical competition between some of the great powers kind of bleed into the wider Afghanistan event. To what extent do you see that bleeding into the actual peace process? Do you see people jostling for national interest? And can you give examples of that? And then I think on this one would be, what areas in a Bond 2 could you see Afghan sides converging over? So, for example, rather than thinking about what divides them, what would be the points of convergence in which you could see something? So, Dr. Rubin, I'll go to you first.
The peace process, and most peace processes this way, does not consist of one forum or one agenda. There are, in the peace process in Burundi, for example, a country in which there continues to be war, but which was nonetheless a somewhat successful peace process, there was a complex mediation involving 4 different groups with different mediators, which took place in Tanzania. In this case, especially because of the financial and military dependence of all the actors in Afghanistan and the presence of the United States, a peace process will have to involve the Afghan actors, Taliban, the various elements of the Afghan government, the state, and other Afghan political actors in different women, ethnic minorities, everybody's various ethnic groups. And that's one level. Then the regional countries who may feel threatened by one or another aspects of a settlement will also have to be involved, because it's very easy to disrupt it. Pakistan has been doing it. Iran could do a lot more. Iranians complain to me that the Americans don't appreciate how much they're not doing in Afghanistan. And they could be much more disruptive. And then there has to be kind of global issue, because the permanent presence of U.S. military bases in Afghanistan changes the strategic structure of the Asian continent. And that is of concern to Russia and China. I don't need to tell you that they're important countries. So, in order, and they have their own, Russia is very close to Iran, China is very close to Pakistan, those 2 groups are converging. So, in different forums, all of those issues have to be discussed among different players. And that's why possibly you will ultimately need a UN umbrella over the various forums, formal and informal talks, in order to reach and more important, implement some kind of a settlement.
I mean, as I started to think about that question, I thought, oh God, Bond 2 could be even more of a disaster than Bond 1. Because actually, points of convergence, I mean, how much has Afghanistan changed? And we've seen significant changes, and we all know the different points about development and women's rights and et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of putting people around a table together and expecting them to come up with a different approach, I'm still not sure how far along we are. I think there is an understanding that we need to have all different parts of this conflict, which I think is civil and I don't think is two-sided, around a table, and that needs to be discussed amongst each other. But you know, when we look at resolving a conflict, it was my old professor, David Keane, who said we need to look at who's winning and not who's losing. And right now, there are significant people on all sides of the conflict that are benefiting. So unless you could come up with a negotiated settlement of bond to ensure that those people continue to win, I can imagine that that would still be, you know, incredibly difficult process. And I mean, things that I would like to see in terms of kind of resetting the Afghan state, looking at issues of transitional justice, highly unlikely to be addressed, particularly if we look at what's happening with the ICC and obviously the US issues in that regard as well.
The experience of track 2 processes is that when Afghans, including the Taliban, get together and talk about basic principles of government, they agree about them very quickly. This is what happened at in the meeting in Chantilly in France. What that says to me is that that's not what the conflict is about. The difficult issue will be about who gets to carry the guns and who funds and supports those people who get to carry the guns. That would be very difficult. That was the most difficult issue at Bond 1 also, although it does not appear in public. But behind the scenes, that was the main issue.
So we'll now open up to the floor. Can I just ask you quickly say your name and your affiliation, and if you also keep your questions, comments under around 2 minutes so that we can get in at 5 people if we can try. So I see these 3 gentlemen. Maybe we can take them as a cluster. Is there a microphone going around? No, there's not. It's this one. The microphone, if you have it, you speak. So if we can pass it to the gentleman there with the red thing, and then afterwards, and then this gentleman here, and we'll go for the second part.
Well, Taimur Iqbal from Prime TV. This is an area which has probably not been discussed too much is the increasing Chinese influence in Pakistan, in Afghanistan. Recently, there has been a military sort of understanding between 2 countries. China has agreed to train Afghan troops. And obviously one understands China's own incentives or concerns the radicalization in their Xinjiang province. Perhaps losing the US influence in Afghanistan, protecting their own CPEC One Belt, One Route project, they also see it as a big concern. And it makes perfect sense for them to actually get more involved in Pakistan. How would the US view that relationship? One.
Just keep it at 1.
Just quickly one.
Just keep it at 1 because we've got 3 people, but we only have time. So just that one is a really good question. You can come back in at Q&A and then take it to the next person. So sorry.
Khalid doing citation to his oral. What changes have you seen with President Trump? Also changes in US foreign policy under President Trump. What is the priorities of Afghanistan being given? And secondly, what is the role of China?
One question. I know you already have a question. Yeah, so you can pass the mic to the next person. I should have said, let's stick to one question.
Who's best in white?
This gentleman over here, and this gentleman.
Hi, is one question or 2?
Just the one.
My name is Sergio. I'm a political activist. So my question is on. I have 2 questions, but I'll give very well just to one. Who stand benefit from that peace process in Afghanistan? So, like ISIS is the Taliban who are negotiating. They are not matter. The Taliban movement or jihadi movement is evolving. It's like you said, if you that some group get old and they're negotiating, and they will be replaced by someone else. But the jihad is still have an appeal, and so many people so joining the jihad. But then the spoiler, why you don't name them like what's Iran's role in this? What is a Pakistan role in this? What is Chinese role in that? Or even for what and then Russia?
Excellent. Thank you. So so I'll ask both of you just to answer the questions that you feel that you know.
Okay, let me take that last one. I mean, I think I did say spoilers. Primarily, I think Pakistan potentially won. Not really sure how they're going to react. It's been a little bit quiet of late, but I don't see them being massively happy with a peace process that wouldn't allow them the strategic depth that they've always wanted inside Afghanistan. So it will be important to at least bring them in. Iran, well, I think Barney's right in the sense that they could interfere a lot more. That's always a potential risk. That was a concern actually when you ended up having the nuclear deal and there was a lot more money being able to flow into Iran, that actually would have more economic capacity to be able to do more malevolent things. But let's see where that goes. But, you know, the other spoilers being the Afghan government. You know, the individuals who do not think that they will benefit from an increased Taliban presence and increased Pashtun voice in the country. In terms of China, yeah, I mean, China, I think, has been kind of touching the water with Afghanistan. I think Afghanistan would like a lot more engagement from China because it sees it as more of a neutral ally, irrespective of the relationship with Pakistan. But China, you know, when I was actually there, they were kind of trying to get involved and they were getting very confused and very frustrated actually with their efforts to help and, you know, then everything backfiring, and I think they got a bit burnt. We've obviously seen an increased CT presence from China since the takeover of Kunduz, so potentially more collaboration in the counterterrorism area with their concerns obviously concerns whether valid or not, but surrounding the Uyghur threat. And then Trump, I think I addressed it, renewed counterterrorism, which I do not think is the right approach.
Well, first of all, I really don't like the use of the word spoiler. Spoiler is a word for people whose interests we don't want to take into account. And it may be a word also for those people whose interests we cannot take into account, which would include the Islamic State, Daesh, and so on. I don't believe that includes Pakistan, though there are maybe other people on this panel who would disagree with me about that. Now, as far as China is, so this is part of a bigger picture, which is the growth of the economies of both China and India, and the growth in relative power of China, India, and other powers compared to the United States. If you look at, in 2001, when the United States went into Afghanistan, the combined economies, the U.S. economy was 4 times the size of the combined economies of Afghanistan's neighbors. If you look at it today, the U.S. economy is, Afghanistan's neighbors are 80% of the U.S. economy. So that's a tremendous change, and it's the direction is constant, and it will have effects. China's involvement is not a one-issue involvement. China is now trying to open up its interior and western regions. That's why all the control in Xinjiang and so on, and sees itself sees its future is as a predominant power in the Eurasian continent, reaching not like controlling Europe or something idiotic like that, but in cooperation with others, and therefore sees peace and stability in Afghanistan as a strategic objective, not only because of Xinjiang or because of minerals. In turn, that is why the United States initially welcomed the increase of Chinese interest in Afghanistan, because we thought that it would help with Pakistan, and it has to some extent, but I found that I've been involved with China as a diplomat and as a scholar doing track 2 for over 6 years now, and I have found that the Chinese have a rather different time frame for judging the success of policies than Americans do. So things are not going at the rate we might like. Today, it's not by no means inevitable or even probable, but it is not impossible that this region could undergo similar transformation. A lot will depend on the emerging relations between China and India, which is not the subject of this talk. As far as what changes in the United States under President Trump, look, as recent revelations have made clear, we have a dual power system in the government today. President Trump and the state. It's not a deep state, it's a superficial state, because even his political appointees are trying to control him. But the thing is, on Afghanistan, there's a particularly big gap, because Trump has made it clear for many years that he thinks what we're doing in Afghanistan is nonsense, so we we should just get out of there except for killing as many bad guys as we can. And I'm not oversimplifying, that is his position. However, the people in the government, the military was still committed to trying to have a kind of get us in this elusive position of strength before we would have which is always desirable, but the enemy gets a vote in that. So I think now the thing about Trump's strategy, which was not really Trump's strategy, but which was announced by Trump, what the core of it was, the U.S. will have an indefinite commitment to Afghanistan until the conditions are right. That is a conditions-based rather than time-based strategy. But that's out the window because everyone knows that Trump has no patience for it. So whereas Obama had a timetable and was trying to organize in a rational way the U.S. Reducing its involvement in Afghanistan, meanwhile the state is going on carrying out its policy, but none of them knows when they will wake up and see a tweet saying we're finished with Afghanistan. So that is one of the main reasons that is things that have put pressure on them to try to seek political settlement.
I hate to say, I wanted to get another round in there, and we will get more rounds in the following session. We're supposed to break, because we already are half an hour behind, for coffee for 15 minutes to come back at 3:45. What I recommend, those hands that shot up, and to the gentleman who was patient but unfortunately lost out, they are going for coffee. They are unguarded. Yeah, you should certainly come up and ask them questions.